Welcome to Creating Irresistible APIs. I'm going to talk about what it is I'm going to talk about. So if all of you wanted something different, I'm not going to feel bad if you head off. I am Kirsten Hunter. I'm currently an API evangelist at Akamai. I've been working with APIs for almost 10 years. I started out creating APIs at Social Text. I've worked at Netflix and LinkedIn and 3Scale. So I've worked at a lot of companies that did a bunch of different things with APIs, and I have a lot of experience helping developers be successful with APIs. And I've learned a lot about the things that cause developers to be sad. I tell people that I wander the world teaching companies how to develop APIs that don't make developers cry, and teaching developers how to use APIs without crying. So what I'm going to do here is try to do the first thing for you. I'm going to try to teach you how to create APIs that developers want to use, that are successful, that don't have huge support costs, and that can be an A-list API that people really want to use. Just for some context, my goal in life is to reduce the amount of frustration in the world, and this is a place where there's plenty of frustration to get rid of. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit we haven't even gotten started. So I will tell you, I am going to talk at a high level. This talk is great for product managers, for developers, for anyone who wants to understand the best way to design an API from top level. So there will be no code, and it's not a highly technical talk, although these theories are quite useful for anyone who's going to be involved in APIs. Okay, so my presentation style. I love Haiku Deck. I think it's fantastic. The choices that you guys tend to have are, if I put bullets up there, then I read the bullets to you, and you read the bullets. It's like story time. We all fall asleep. It's not super fun. It's late enough in the day. I want you guys to pay attention to me. I want you to, and I want to be able to pay attention to you guys and see if you're connecting with what I'm talking about. So, however, on SlideShare, there's a version of this that has the notes that I'm using. And so if you want to go back and see what the context is, you're welcome to take a look at those slides. In the SlideShare notes, I also have my Twitter handle, which is Synedra, S-Y-N-E-D-R-A, and my website information as well. So why should you have an API? Why does your company need an API? If you are trapped in the elevator with your CEO and he says, why do we have an API? And your answer is, because API, it's cool, everyone should have one. Your CEO might then say, well, that's a lot of engineers you have working on a non-revenue producing product. If that's the best you have, I don't really think we need to keep the API. All those people are going to go work on something else now. So you need to understand what the business value is of your API. And I'm going to talk through a bunch of different things that different companies have done to successfully understand what the business value of their API is. Mobile market penetration. So market penetration, I like to talk about Netflix. If you think about Netflix, think about the fact that what they have done is they've made it so that if you buy a TV, a smart TV of any kind, it has Netflix on it. You buy a Blu-ray player, Netflix is on there. Netflix is on all of your consoles. Netflix is everywhere. If someone doesn't put Netflix on their system, they have created a market disadvantage for themselves. So by becoming the de facto standard, Netflix has created a place for them in the marketplace, and it's going to be very difficult to unseat them. So if you have an API, you can make it possible to penetrate the market more completely and get out to mobile devices. People really love using mobile devices. Driving usage. The social networks, such as Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, they're driven by user touch, user reach. They want to get as many people as possible. They want to have them touch the system as often as possible. So encouraging developers to integrate with their applications, whatever those applications do, is critical to maintaining their market share. Defensive strategy, getting there first. So I'm going to tell you another story that doesn't necessarily have to do with APIs, which is the story of Amazon and Borders and Barnes and Noble. So Amazon came along and they're like, we're going to be the internet bookstore, and Borders was like, internet. that's not a thing. So they're dead now. And Barnes and Noble did a pretty decent job. They tried to do the ebook stuff, and they're still struggling because Amazon has a lot of advantages in this space, not having to have brick and mortar stores. But the people who were like, no, that's totally not a thing, it didn't work out. So if you can get there first and define the marketplace, define your industry and how it's going to work with integrations, it's going to help you just like it helped Netflix. In the API world, Best Buy was one of the first brick and mortar based companies to have a really strong API, and they've used it for partner integrations, and as a result, they've thrived in the new internet age. Circuit City didn't get on board, and so it didn't work out for them. So this is to say, making an API early on is actually quite valuable. Even if you don't know what it is that you expect to get out of it, but even if it's just reach, figure out what it is that you want to do with it. Partner connectivity. This is my favorite reason to have an API. Monetization is almost never the reason to have an API, but partner connectivity does have a lot to do with your revenue. I call it partner stickiness. Once that partner has spent 100 hours integrating your API into their systems, it's going to take a lot of work for someone to say, oh, this other system is so much better, we want to integrate with this system. The developer managers are going to be like, no, we got other stuff to do. So you can create partner stickiness. You can get your partners to be reluctant to leave your product and give you a much better handle on keeping them as your partners. So I'm going to talk a little bit about technical cases. Sometimes if your product is an API, you make something that's hard easy to do. And that can be the product that you sell. So integration with email. Producing emails that work great in any email reader, scheduling stuff, making sure that everything works out well. It's kind of hard, and it takes a lot of work. So SendGrid has actually made this very easy to do. They're a metered system, and they take something that's pretty difficult, make it easier, and that's why their API is pretty successful. So improving interfaces. So again, about email. There's a thing about managing your email. I'm sure we've all used the Gmail interface, which is fantastically great at organizing your emails. Context.io actually makes it possible for you to do a lot of triggering behaviors. You can organize your email. An application can do all sorts of things. It can analyze the email that you've gotten previously in a much more reasonable way than just a basic search. So Context.io, and I'm going to give you guys an example. We're going to go to story mode here because it's late and I like telling stories. One of my favorite examples of an API client that I would like to make that mashes a few things up is a Context.io plugin that looks at my email and figures out if the emails from my parents came from Snopes or if they're available on Snopes, or if it says put your name at the bottom of this list and send recipes to all the other people. And I figure what'll happen is it'll throw that in my junk box, so I don't have to look at it at all. And then we'll use Twilio to call them at 3 o'clock in the morning and remind them about email etiquette, because I've seen those things way too often. So that's kind of an example of what would be useful to do with Context.io. Metered usage. Amazon is the most famous place where we have metered usage. Heroku also does it as well. And this is a really fantastic use case if they want to attract new developers, new customers who don't have a lot of money to spend on an entirely fresh setup. So people can try things out, they can scale up as they start to succeed, and then when they need to go to their own infrastructure, they can do that. All of the above. So Twilio I mentioned them earlier with calling, robocalling your parents with a mean call at 3 o'clock in the morning. Twilio does all of the above. They're a company that makes SMS and voice calls, which are incredibly difficult to do, super easy. It's a REST API. They are actually one of the best people, the best companies to look at in terms of developer experience. They have a rule that says a developer should be able to make a call against the system within 5 minutes of coming to the website. 5 minutes. I always say that developers are like wild animals on the savannah wandering around looking for a watering hole. And your watering hole has to be really attractive to get them to stay longer than that 5 minutes that they've sort of allocated to your API. So Twilio is successful first because they make something that is extremely hard for any random developer to do, but also because they make it very, very easy to use that system, even easier than the system itself. Architectural considerations. That's probably what you thought I was going to talk about. Architectural considerations are important. How do you want people to use your API? What kind of system are you going to use? What language you're going to code in? I'm here to tell you HTTP is not super efficient as it is. You need to focus on your use cases and not on how you're going to solve the problem. If you don't know what the use cases are, if you haven't figured out what your business value is, how you're going to measure it, and what you want people to do with the API, then it doesn't matter what kind of architecture you make. If you make an API that's not usable, nobody's going to use it. So you're trying to attract people, you're trying to make stuff that's easy to use. Affordances. Okay, this is just sort of a quickie for you guys. It's what can people do? What can people do on my system? And that's, again, should be driven by the use cases that you have. You're going to make use cases, you're going to say, my business value is that I want people to interact with the system, and so one of the use cases that I have is mobile. I want to make it easy for people to create mobile devices, and they should have these features. That's going to help you create an API that's actually meaningful for the users and quick to learn. Schema. Schema is a lot like the architectural considerations. It's important. It is not more important than your use cases, your business value, and how you're going to measure them. It is a path. Once you figure out what those use cases are and what you want to be easy in your system, then you're going to figure out how you're going to present that stuff so it's easy for people to do. Depending on the use cases that you want to support, for instance, mobile devices, mobile developers are very, very strongly attached to the notion of making one call per screen for a very good reason. Your users, they walk into an elevator, they go into a tunnel. If you're having to make 50 calls to build that screen, app's not performant. There's going to be failures, and it's going to be a bad experience for the user. So one of the things you need to do with your schema is think about those sorts of things. What is it that your developers are going to want to do in those use cases that you want to support? If you want to support mobile devices and do a fantastic job, then maybe you'll put a query language in your API so people can say exactly what they want and what they don't want. Maybe you just want to, Netflix has an expand, so all of their devices get all of the information about all of the things that they get. Because those devices have really big, fat internet pipes that are designed for streaming movies. And so it's not an unreasonable thing. But a mobile device really needs to be as efficient as possible. Okay, who can do what? Authentication and authorization. This is a quick overview of something that people tend to conflate. So authentication, let's think about this in the real world. I have a driver's license. That's my authentication. But if my driver's license says I'm 17 years old and I try to go buy beer, I can't. Driver's license identifies me. That's authentication. But my age defines whether I am authorized to do a particular thing. Authorization, in the computer world, generally a good way to think of it is there's almost always users of a site and administrators of a site. Just because someone can log in doesn't mean they're going to be able to administer the site. You want to have that control. So try to be really careful when you're talking about these and understand that they are two different concepts and they should be managed separately. All right, so what I'm trying to get to is your API is a product. It should be a first-class product. It should be treated in your system exactly like any other product. Even if the API is not your main product, it should be treated as if it were. So you're thinking, again, what is your business value? How are you going to measure things? What use cases are valid? And the API needs to make these things really, really easy. This is my one of my favorite examples, so people can sort of understand. And we have this situation in really big companies. So a lot of times people say, hey, developers, what you need to do, now you need to write your code. You have to write your tests, which they really don't like. You have to write some documentation. They also don't like that. And now you have to spit out an API at the other end. And so they're like, hey, I ran it through Spring, and I totally barfed out an API. It's good to go. And you're like, yeah, it looks just like that. How are people going to use it? What are they going to do with it? So you need to teach your developers how do you write APIs that are meaningful for use cases. I use this potato so organically grown APIs are not a Zen rock garden. They are, in fact, like a potato you left in your garage, and it grew a bunch of sprouts. So no, it's kind of ugly. No one wants to use it. It's kind of gross. So we're trying to go more for the Zen rock garden. Make a meaningful API that you actually designed. API first. This is something you guys might hear about, and it's the theory that if you make an API first and run all of your products on it, including your website, your mobile devices, and your third-party developer applications, then everything will be consistent. You won't be adding one feature over here and one feature over there. You don't have the duplicated code. So you're all going to tell me, I can't do that. I already have a system, and it's really complicated. Or, I don't have a system yet. I'm a startup, and that's too much work. But I will tell you, Etsy did this. Etsy's a solid company. They're totally valid. They moved $1 billion in transactions last year. And they moved to API first earlier this year, and they found that it was a fantastic move for them. They increased communication between their internal teams, and they actually discovered that a couple of their products that they hadn't targeted with the API became much more efficient, on the order of minutes, something they had to do asynchronously, to seconds, something that they could do synchronously. The user activity feed was the one they were looking at. Okay, so I'm getting close on time. So use cases. Again, think about those mobile developers. Measuring success. So again, we're in the elevator with the CEO, and we're trying to figure out what the heck we're trying to do with the API. We've told him what we're trying to do is partner stickiness. How do you measure that? Executives care deeply about how you measure success. What are your metrics that you're going to aim for? How are you going to show that this API is awesome? It also helps you with marketing, and it also helps you with documentation, tutorials, and use cases to know what it is that you're trying to do. Stand on the shoulders of giants. Copy other people's APIs. APIs, once they're out, they're public. If you make an API that's very similar to another API that is like the one that you've created, you make it easier for developers to work with it. You make it easier for developers to integrate between the two APIs that make the very similar work. The API Commons system has actually been created. If you guys want to look that up, I'll actually put that in my notes. It's not in there yet. API Commons is a project, an open project, that is designed for people to check their schemas into a GitHub repository so that people can define how their schemas work. And people can say, I'm using the user from that version, and I'm using the health information from that version. And inform your decisions based on what other people in your industry are doing. Don't try to be overly clever, because developers don't want to spend a lot of time learning a new system. Developer experience. I talked a little bit about this before with Twilio. What I'm going to say is your developer experience informs, especially for open APIs, how successful you're going to be. But I will also argue that even for enterprise internal closed APIs, this is also critical because your developer experience will reduce your support cost. It'll make it much easier for people to use the API, it'll reduce the friction, and you'll spend a lot less time walking them through difficult things. Communication, this is one of the things that people are always surprised to hear. Okay, so you know your business value, you know how you're measuring it, you know what your use cases are, and you've created your API to make those use cases easy. I would argue that you need to tell all those things to your developers unless you have some compelling reason not to. Why is that? Because many APIs out there have been created, people built things against them that they monetized, and then everything changed. So now we have to teach users to trust us. Yes, we thought about it. We have this API. These are the things we're trying to accomplish, and this is how we're measuring it. If you help them help you to be successful, if you treat them like partners, they will behave like partners. They will try to make you successful while they're successful. They don't want your API to fail if they're building things on it, again, whether it's internal or external. So communicate with them. Treat them like your partners. Marketing to developers is not like marketing to normal people. We don't like pictures. We're not that excited about words. We like toys. We like you to give us something that's working code, that we can build it together and make a cool thing out of it. Market to your developers by showing them how to play. Remember, we all like to play. Developers are generally gamers. Treat them that way. Make sure that they have a good experience. Fun, even. You can even do leveling up through tutorials and whatnot, and that actually really helps a lot, rather than having 17-page tutorials that people have to slog through, and when they come back, they don't know what's going on. Code Academy is a really excellent example of breaking things down into small, consumable chunks. So try to think about that when you make your documentation. Encourage users to use your API by providing ways to explore the API, or access the API, or troubleshoot the API using tools. Don't make them write the code from scratch if all they want to do is figure out what your API does. All right, we're getting to my favorite thing now, which is asking questions. Teach your developers how to ask you questions. So I always say, I did X, I expected Y to happen, but to my dismay, Z happened instead. And a lot of times users will say Z happened. You're like, yeah? What were you doing at the time? And they'll say, well, I was doing X. And you're like, uh-huh. What did you expect to happen? And they're like, well, why? Okay, so now you've iterated 4 times. You already had a developer who was frustrated. They probably already tried to fix the problem. You want to teach them how to ask a question so you can answer it right away. If you think that these things aren't important, I'll give you an example. I jumped off the cliff. I expected to sprout wings and fly. To my dismay, I plunged to my death instead. No bugs in gravity. I had a bad understanding of what was going to happen. And that can also be a bug. You need to tell your users, yes, even if it's a documentation bug or an expectation bug. Part of supporting users is making sure that they understand what the expectations are for the system. All right, SDKs. To sum up, I don't like them. If your API needs SDKs, you need to fix your API. You're putting a layer of abstraction between your users and the system. So now there's 3 places that it can fail. It can fail in the client, it can fail in the SDK, it can fail in the system. It's much harder for them to troubleshoot if they don't understand how the API works by writing directly to it. I don't have a problem with third-party libraries, but I do have a problem with companies that have 7 SDKs for 7 different languages. You also create for yourself an enormous amount of technical debt. That means every time you change your API, you have to change all 7 of those SDKs. John Sheehan, who worked at If This Then That, and several other companies that have had very successful APIs, he gives a talk sometimes called "Don't Let SDKs Ruin Your Life Like They Ruined Mine." So I'm going to say, from someone who worked with a lot of users, don't use SDKs. All right, all intelligent discourse on the internet ends as soon as a cat picture is posted. So Here's mine. You're welcome to ask me any questions about APIs, developer support. Doesn't have to be on this stuff. I am an API evangelist and have done it for a long time, so I'm happy to talk to you guys about whatever you're interested in for 5 minutes. Any questions? Yes?
A lot of the reason why sites don't provide an API is because they don't have to put their advertising or similar in front of the clients of the API.
Mm-hmm.
This is a lot of the reason why APIs are able to move sites will blow up down.
That's one of the reasons that you want to understand what your business value is. If you're hoping to monetize it, you're probably not going to succeed unless it's your main product. So you have to understand, what am I trying to do? Am I trying to get people to use the system? Am I trying to get people to make changes on the system? Figure out what that is, and then the API will be more successful. Yes?
What's your opinion of meta API things, like JSON API that are kind of defining a convention for what an API looks like and how it does meta?
I like JSON and .api, the setting up the idea of figuring out. Do you mean figuring out, is it schemas you're talking about, or are you talking about apis.json, which is sort of trying to make it searchable on the internet?
No, I mean specifically there's a meta project called JSON API, which provides an upfront schema that everybody can adapt their own API to and provides standard input.
So the goal of that project was actually to make it possible to search for APIs on the internet. That was actually put together by Kin Lane and Steve Wilmot of 3Scale. I used to work at 3Scale. I think it's pretty excellent. One of the problems that we have right now is that if you go to CNN.com, you can't figure out where you might find the APIs or what they do. So having like robots.txt, having a way to describe at the root level of the API what APIs are there and also what other APIs are related to it or connected to it is a fantastically useful thing. So I support actually imposing a little bit more standards on the APIs. I always used to call it the Wild Wild West because we all sort of got on our cowboy hats and our boots and we made an API and it was great. It was better than anyone else's, but it wasn't. It was pretty much the same. So we're going to try to have best practices so that API developers, people who are developing the APIs themselves, are creating things that people can use easily and quickly and successfully. Anyone else? Yes?
Can you go into what kind of metrics you use?
So if you have a website already, and for instance you have a very expensive configuration page that is on the website, and you want to encourage your partners to integrate with the API rather than using the website for this manual yucky thing, maybe you would measure what percentage of the configuration changes are done via the website as opposed to the API. You could measure how many people are doing automated things with the API. If you're looking at things that are reporting, it's actually going to be much better if they're going ahead and grabbing that on a regular basis rather than getting it manually from the web page. So this is, in that case, it would be partner stickiness. So that's a thing where you're like, how useful is this being to our partners? Are we actually providing them with a useful service? And if we are, then we can take this, we can scale much more easily. So that's an example. You can also count how many users are touching the site or writing to the site via the APIs versus the website. You can, whatever it is that you want to accomplish, you should be able to measure it in some reasonable way. And this is just a high-level measure. Again, we're imagining the CEO asking you questions, and you're like, well, we're trying to get partners not to leave. Who's gonna argue with that? Anyone else? Any API questions? General API questions? Okay, so please do look at my slides on SlideShare. I have a couple of other presentations that talk about how to be successful with APIs as a consumer and as a producer. And I am happy to take questions. I have my email in my slides as well as my Twitter handle. I would prefer Twitter because my clout score could use the help, but I'm cool with emails as well. So thanks very much and have a great evening.